Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We're pleased to have you be able to attend our IMI Prefer webinar on our recent EMA qualification for the Prefer framework. Today, we're joined by members of our qualification team and other invited guests, where we will learn and hear more about this very exciting and very impactful achievement for the Prefer Consortium. This morning, we will have with us as speakers Isabel Stockert from Bayer, Mireille Müller from Novartis, Jürgen Kubler from QSciCon, Kristen Bullock from Eli Lilly and Company, Isabel Huss from KU Leuven, Bennett Leviton from Janssen, and Brett Halber from Pfizer. We also are pleased that we have distinguished panel members, Irina Klimpet, Laura Lee Johnson, and Isabel Stockert. With that, we'll move to the next slide. This is our landing slide in which we wanted to highlight to you that if you go to the EMA website on opinions and letters of support, you can see that there near the bottom in blue, IMI Prefer, certainly the qualification opinion can be found there. It's an active link, so if you click on that link, it will take you to the opinion where you can download it and read it in full. Next slide, please. And this is our little way of celebrating and denoting, highlighting the IMI Prefer opinion, as well as celebrating the achievement of the opinion. Next slide, please. This is our overview for today. So today we're going to walk you through a little bit of the history around our journey towards the qualification. So we'll provide a little bit of a background on what our process experience is and was, some of the implications for industry and regulators, as well as some of the many successes and challenges we had as we went through the qualification procedure. We'll then move to talk a little bit about what we had in the submission for the qualification, so the Prefer framework. We'll talk a little bit about the importance that qualitative research plays in supporting the development of the framework and the application of it to patient preference studies. We'll then have an overview of the methods that we highlighted in the qualification. And then Brett will round out this section by talking about some of the de novo points to consider that we developed in support of the framework and our methods discussion. And then we'll move into our panel session. So without any further delay, I'll hand it over to Isabel, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Becky, for the introduction. And let me start with saying for us in the regulatory arena, having a qualification opinion by the regulators and HTA's endorsement of our frameworks is the holy grail that everyone wants to achieve. Yeah? So seeing the qualification opinion by the European regulators on IMI Prefer is really the holy grail for us. And it's the first IMI project reaching this within the framework and the time of the project itself. It was not an easy journey, I would say, and we really need to thank the Prefer team and thank the regulators and the HTAs who have been involved and joining us on this journey. And you will see from the next chart why this was such a long journey. It's an iterative process, a learning process that is needed to qualify a topic in the regulatory arena. And that means that everybody needs to familiarize themselves with the topic. It needs some scoping, and therefore it needs a series of interactions. So what you see here is we have the pre-consultation, the qualification advice itself, and the qualification opinion. And during this iterative process, we went from the objective of qualifying methods to qualifying a framework, to qualifying a points to consider, and to qualifying 5 different messages along with that. And we will hear more about this from our colleagues when we come to the content of the qualification advice and our perspective on that. Then we started out with a big scope, a wide scope, and that's another holy grail. A parallel advice by the CHMP and the EUnetHTA is another holy grail in Europe for getting advice and bringing also regulators and HTAs together. And this was only possible because we have people from all these different stakeholder groups in our preferred team. So congratulations to everyone involved. In the end, and we will talk to that in a minute, EUnetHTA had some changes in the scoping, therefore we moved forward then with the qualification opinion only with the CHMP. And as you can see from the timelines, the first time Mireille and I met with the EMA was already in 2018, so a long time before starting into the original procedure. And then already then we had to prepare together with the team a briefing book. And from there, as you can see, lots of different meetings, iterative 3 briefing books were really on the way to the journey until we had just in time, and thanks to EMA, the published final opinion in May this year. And on the next chart, you see a bit of the challenges that accompanied us on this way. One was certainly an aspirational objective. I already called it out, to really align the stakeholders and all the stakeholders at the same time who are responsible for patient access in Europe. The second was an undisputed amount of disruptions that we had, like both on the EMA and the regulatory agencies level. We had the Brexit with the MHRA moving out. We had the pandemic. Nobody expected to be in our way for all these face-to-face meetings. We had leadership changes, both in the way how the regulators have been leading this advice, because there were changes amongst the regulators, but also in the committees that were responsible for supporting us here. And we had lots of resource issues because, as you can imagine, Brexit and pandemia caused a scarcity, both on the EMA side as well as on other regulatory agencies. And also on HTA levels, Brexit kicked in, so NICE was not available for a European EUnetHTA approach anymore. EUnetHTA itself changed its scoping and its constituency during that time. So lots of changes to allude to. On the stakeholder management side, we had the challenge to keep our advisory boards of HTAs and regulators separate from a qualification process where the regulators assess what we are doing. And I think that worked very well, but it was a challenge in the beginning. We also had to understand the principles of the qualification, the fit for purpose message, the context of use as a focus point for how do you do a qualification and what methods to qualify. And there's a good guidance out there, but the guidance alone is not enough, as we realized soon. Briefing books require specific medical writing skills, which are different from writing publications. So also here, recommendation to future teams to look into this and get medical writing skills on board. And then we had procedural challenges, 3 briefing books, 2 fees to pay. There's still no waiver for public-private partnerships, but we are working on that on the policy level. And there's only 1 formal contact possible to EMA, and that is not easy for a public-private partnership of couples and dozens of people who want to be involved. But there were also very good things about what we did, and that's on the next chart. The opportunities that we had from this is really to explore with all the regulators and amongst each others on the value of usefulness of the patient preference studies. It enabled the regulators to deepen their understanding on patient preference research and sharpen their perspective. And we also learned about the different regulators' view, because EMA and FDA have different considerations. The national agencies have different considerations here. And it was important to support consensus building. Then we also had to redirect some of the preferred research because we got very clear stakeholder perspective in the end that changed some of our thinking as well. And it impacted our recommendations, and we will talk to that in a minute. It also established an exchange between the regulatory agencies and HTA's bodies, but we felt there's still not enough opportunities for dialogue, and that still should be fostered in future. But there's many more to say, and I hand over to my colleague Mireille to continue. presentations.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I'm happy to continue the discussion on what enabled the qualification procedure. So one of the key features of the parallel EMA HTA qualification procedure is really to allow for this informal, formal discussion on scientific matters amongst all the involved partners. The applicant here, it was the preferred consortium, the regulators, and the health technology assessment bodies. As Isabel pointed out, the in-depth review of the qualification package allowed all the involved stakeholders to mature their thinking on patient preferences. The public consultation phase also broadened the discussion to external actors in the field of patient engagement. So this scientific exchange allowed to have a better understanding on what are the validity and acceptability criteria from the regulator's perspective, and to a certain extent from the HTA's perspective. Finally, like the preferred project, the qualification procedure enabled to socialize patient preference information beyond an initially relatively small circle of specialists to a much larger circle of people. If we go to the next slide. So what could be future benefits of this qualification opinion? In terms of future benefits, we hope that it will act as a catalyst and trigger some reflection on the use of patient preference information. That in turn will start a virtuous circle by increasing sponsors' confidence in designing and conducting patient preference studies, and then by gaining experience in reviewing and assessing patient preference information, decision makers such as regulators, health technology assessment bodies, and payers will become increasingly familiar and confident in using patient preference information for their decision making. So this accumulated experience will in turn allow the issuance of guidance in the field. Overall, we are convinced that patient preference inclusion in decision-making will strengthen the development of medical products by designing better trials with endpoints that matter and at last lead to improved patient outcome. One major change is the move from direct patient input, for example, testimony, to much more systematic, quantitative and qualitative patient involvement, representing truly the patients with a big, bold S at the end, voice, and their preferences. Patient preferences can really inform decision-making throughout the entire medical product life cycle. The case studies of Prefer have demonstrated that. And transparency is also one important aspect I want to cover here, which will facilitate the adoption of patient preferences and ultimately provide healthcare solutions that will optimally benefit patients. If we go to the next slide. As mentioned previously, what is the added value of qualification opinion? We are really hopeful that this qualification opinion will act as a catalyst, increasing certainty in the development and presentation of patient preference information. The preferred recommendations can inform sponsors of patient preference studies from development to submission of their marketing authorization application in the EU to new drug applications in the US. And everywhere else in the world. All this iterative dialogue, culminating with the qualification opinion, might lead to a fit-for-purpose application to the FDA, possibly, which is the equivalent for the EMA qualification procedure. Finally, all this work can become one of the components of the ICH guideline proposal on patient-focused drug development. So there is much more to come. But I'm happy to hand over now to Jürgen who will guide you through the remaining of the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mireille, for that. So I'm talking about successes and challenges within the qualification process. And I should mention that I will do that specifically from the perspective of a public-private partnership. And I would like to talk about three critical areas. That the one is managing the expectations, and Mireille and Isabel already touched on that to a certain extent, on the importance of planning, and maybe one of the most important topics, understanding your stakeholder needs and expectations. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, there's one point that's a given in any qualification process, and that it has to be based on sound scientific evidence. That's true for now, and is going to be true for the future. There was one thing specifically in a public-private partnership that's not very familiar to everybody in the team, and that's basically that you have to take regulatory and policy considerations into account as well, on top of the scientific evidence. And that may result in a situation where some of your public partners may develop a perception that the qualification is kind of an industry add-on to your project objectives, which actually, I think from a preferred perspective, is not true. So it really, what we achieved here is an alignment of the qualification objectives and the overall project objectives, even to the point, as Isabel described, that some of the recommendations were adjusted with all the learnings we had from the qualification in that space. And it really, one of the issues is that it's creating a dependency with external bodies. So you need to take into account that when you look at this iterative process, that this is not completely under your control from a project management perspective within your own project. So you need to find ways to maneuver the territory and to cope with these uncertainties you have once you go for the qualification. Next slide, please. So the learnings, and what you've seen, what we've done in Prefer already, is that it's starting early. You can't start early enough, basically, with thinking about the qualification. Ideally, we think we should build the plans for the qualification into your work plan. However, it's important to be realistic regarding your deliverables, just because of these dependencies I was alluding to earlier. And you need to engage your stakeholders at a very, very early stage to understand where their needs and requirements are, so that you can basically build a realistic plan that finds also support from your stakeholders and creates a win-win situation. One of the other important topics is securing resources. So in our case, it was a little bit of an extra effort that came in at a certain point in time. And due to the flexibility we had to build in there and the feedback we got from the stakeholders, we even had to change our objectives of the plan with the requirement to have additional resources, additional budget, bringing external bodies in to help us to finalize on the qualification briefing books and stuff like that. All that needs to be managed. You need to have an atmosphere and understanding that this kind of flexibility is needed and needs to be built into the process. And that, of course, also requires that you are not only managing and talking to your external stakeholders, but also with your internal stakeholders on the project. Next slide, please. So finally, again, I think the most important aspect from my point of view is that setting you up for success is understanding your stakeholders and your stakeholder needs in a way. So you need to ask yourself questions like, how does the intended qualification you're going to fit to your stakeholders' strategic plans? So make them understand that what you're doing is not something that they have to assess and look at because you're paying for that, so to speak, and you're requesting it, but that it is an activity that basically helps them also to achieve their own goals in a way. So you need, that's the second question then as to how the qualification you're going for helps your stakeholders to achieve their own objectives. So if you're in that space, that increases your probability of success of the qualification. Also equally important is it to understand what the potential concerns of your stakeholders may be in the space. So we were in the beginning going for a more narrow qualification. You will learn more about that, which raised concerns that the focus on a small number of methods to be in, or even one only in the qualification, would create a perception in the environment that we would promote a single method in the space for elicitation of patient preferences, which the stakeholders were not comfortable with. And that basically resulted in a major revision of our plan that we had to manage then. You also need to understand what is the strength of evidence that is needed. And that talks to the notion of having something at the end that is fit for purpose and meaningful for all the stakeholders. And finally, you need to have an in-depth discussion and assessment on the feasibility of your plans within the project timelines, given other competing objectives you have in the project. So that's basically one of the big differences to other qualification processes, that within the public-private partnership project like IMI Prefer, you have to work against a fixed deadline at the end of the day. And the challenge is to create something that's meaningful and useful for everybody within these project timelines. So with that, I think I hand over. We will move to the next major topic. And the next speaker is then probably Bennett, right? No, Christine, sorry.
Hi, no problem. Thank you, Jürgen and all. So now that you've heard highlights about the qualification process, we're going to move now into the content and the impact the process had on our documents overall. So on the next slide, at the highest level, you've probably gathered that what the qualification included was the preferred framework for patient preference studies and points to consider on method selection. So Isabel and myself will talk about the framework a little bit, and then you'll hear more about the points to consider on method selection following us. On the next slide then, I highlight the 4 main endorsements that you will find within the qualification opinion. The framework, firstly, provides a platform for useful interactions between sponsors and decision makers, and that it can guide decisions. The second endorsement to highlight is the principal objectives of the framework were agreed upon, and I will show you these in a little bit. The last component of the framework, that is the technical approaches for applying preference study results to decisions, were endorsed as valuable. And then finally, within the points to consider, the CHMP acknowledged a relevant spectrum of methods were indeed presented within the points to consider. So on the next slide, as with any research, there are indeed still open topics, and a few of these were highlighted within the qualification opinion. So I wanted to bring these up here. The first one is related to how to define a patient preference sensitive situation. There are different scenarios within preference sensitive situations, and the notable scenario remaining as an open topic is the acceptability of uncertainty. It wasn't immediately clear what such a situation is, and so it remains open as to how a preference study could inform on that topic. Another open topic is how regulatory will disclose their use of preference data in their decision making, as this is heavily dependent upon the decision that could be informed by the data. And then finally, for the final open topic, the examples and technical approaches within the framework on when and how preference data can inform a decision are indeed just that. They remain as examples and require further discussion with the CHMP. And then if you're interested, there are many other open research topics from the Prefer project. And so there's a link here to a publication on that. So on the next slide, just really briefly, what is the framework, the PREFER framework? So I show it here that it's made up of 3 main components. So briefly, the first component includes considerations on how to clearly define the study's purpose and the objectives. The second component includes considerations on getting organized for, designing, and then actually conducting the study. And then the last component, which I've referred to a couple times, is where you'll find the examples and the technical approaches on how to use preference data to inform the decision. Then on the next slide, as I noted earlier, the PREFER framework objectives were endorsed overall, and these are listed here. Essentially, that the PREFER framework provides key considerations for all stages of a fit-for-purpose preference study, and that the framework can provide a platform to support regulatory decisions and discussions between sponsors, for example, industry, and regulators about preference studies. On the final 2 slides that I'll talk to, so on the next slide, we found that the qualification process was extremely valuable to enhance and refine the framework. So importantly, it emphasized the need to include decision makers, here regulatory, HTA body, and payers early on in your design and thinking about a preference study. And that by no means does a preference study replace regulatory judgment. It is also, we wanted to make sure and refine that not all decisions can be meaningfully informed by a preference study. So we also enhanced the text to better communicate important elements related to applicability and reliability of the results. The primary considerations here I note, and they relate to considerations on heterogeneity and composition of the study sample, on the need to pre-specify the elements of design, particularly analytical approaches to be taken, and then in critical places of design, the need to avoid framing bias. Then a few other refinements I want to highlight are on the next slide. And these are the clarification that the PREFER framework is indeed method agnostic. We also provided clear examples of what were called use cases. And these are situations where preference studies could inform, such as clinical endpoint development or benefit risk considerations, because we wanted to focus, and we needed to focus for the regulators, the use of preference research to a little bit more of a narrow approach. And then finally, we enhanced the reflections within the framework on qualitative studies and how the associated data can contribute to decision-making. So this last point is a very nice lead-in to Isabel Hoos, who will now further focus her talk on qualitative research. So Isabel?
Thanks, Kristen. Indeed, the importance of qualitative patient preference research prior to and also hence to inform quantitative patient preference studies became clear throughout PREFER, throughout the qualification procedure, and also throughout the development of the PREFER framework itself. So at the stage of method selection in the PREFER framework, it's about selecting the most appropriate method for the quantitative part, so the survey, but also for the qualitative part. And that qualitative part involves talking with patients individually, so via interviews or in group, via focus group discussions, for instance, and many other methods that have been identified in PREFER. And it can't be emphasized enough how essential such direct contact with patients is for the design of preference questions in the survey. Those interactions with patients in the interviews and in the focus group discussions provide a clear starting base for which characteristics, for instance, life expectancy or pain, need to be selected as attributes for inclusion as attributes in the survey, and also how to label them and how to name them, and especially how to define them so that they are understandable for patients and that they are or make sense for them when the survey is presented to them. And also which levels actually need to be linked to these attributes, how to present these levels in percentages or via visuals, and why. That's all very relevant information which comes out of qualitative research. But the qualitative research can also be very important to inform us about the number of questions we include in such a survey, so that it is feasible for that particular patient population. And also as well to organize the questions, which question comes first, but also which psychological instruments actually for this group needs to be included and why, so that it is feasible. So we can go to the next slide. And here we see that indeed qualitative patient preference research informs us or can inform us about how to develop attributes to answer the question, what matters to patients? But it also is very important to inform many other questions that we will reveal in patient preference studies. How much does it matter to patients? What trade-offs do patients find acceptable? And what about the patient heterogeneity? And it reveals more about the broader context of where patients live in, and as well help us in interpreting the quantitative results of the survey. So we go next. Having attributes that are developed based on the input of patients in a meaningful and relevant way, inclusive of all aspects that might be important for the participants' decisions, also plausible, related to their existing treatment and disease effects, and very clear, is actually increasing the validity of the results of a patient preference study. And as there are many or multiple methods available that can be used in patient preference studies for qualitative or quantitative part, it is very important to know which methods to consider and what are the points to consider for such method selection. And for that, I hand over to Bennett Levitan.
Thank you, Isabel. Isabel described the qualitative preference work that comes before quantitative preference work. And you heard from Jürgen also that there are many methods to assess preferences. You'll see that on the next slide. So one of the concerns, prior slide, keep to the prior slide, please. One of the issues will be, how do we provide guidance on which method to use depending on the research question? Well, it was not realistic to have a descriptive algorithm that would take you all the way through using what method under what conditions. What is realistic and is what's used in practice are points to consider, rules of thumb, guidances based on empirical evidence and other evidence for which methods might be more appropriate under what conditions. So Brett Halber will take you through the points to consider in the next section. What you see here is the EMA and EUnetHTA said that they were comfortable with the high-level structure of the points to consider. They basically agreed to it. And they noted that the in-depth discussion we had on 5 of the various methods you could use for quantitative preference assessments were fine, but these factors should be considered also, factors to consider for many of the other methods beyond those presented. And they wanted to be clear that, even though the 5 methods we described are some of the most commonly used, this is not a prescriptive list. There are many other methods that might be appropriate, and there may be new methods designed in the future. And the qualification opinion basically said these points to consider are appropriate not just for the 5 here, but for many others. So how did we come up with those 5? So on the next slide, you'll see some of the work that occurred earlier in Prefer to assess what are the wide variety of methods that you can use to assess, in this case, preferences from a quantitative perspective. They're organized in one way by the method you might use to elicit them. And the reference below actually can give you some of the details. Some methods are based on thresholding, some are based on ranking alternatives, some are based on rating different methods, and some are the actual discrete choice type approaches. And amongst all these methods, how did we decide which are the most valuable to include in the qualification? So it was kind of fun. We actually used preference methods to assess the preference methods. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the list of criteria that we use to assess these methods. So just like a medical treatment can have benefits and risks, and you'll weigh them when deciding whether benefits outweigh risks, we had criteria to judge the different methods. So can it be done at low cost? Can it be done in quick sessions with participants? Do you need a low frequency of sessions? Can you handle a large number of attributes? And so on. Do you need a small sample size? And the criteria are not going to be constant. If you're early in development and you do or do not know the mechanism of action, it'll be very different than if you're thinking about preference studies in late phase 3, preparing for submission or post-marketing. So we looked at how important these different criteria are, in the sense the preference weights for these criteria are under these 4 conditions. So in the next slide, you can see a figure which shows the weights that we assessed using both Q methodology and analytical hierarchy process. Those are 2 of the preference methods to come up with weights for the criteria that you would use to judge preference methods. So again, preference methods to assess preference methods. And we don't have time to go into the details, but you could see there's mostly similarities, but some important differences as you go from early to late phase. Early phase tends to, the speed with which you can do a preference study is more important, and budgeting is more important. Later phase, you have more time, less budget, so those become less important. Early on, you don't know the attributes as much detail. Later on, you do, and criteria like that come into play. So when we applied this to the different methods, what came out of it? Well, the next slide shows the methods that percolated to the top. I'm going to just focus on the ones on bottom. Those are the elicitation or quantitative methods rather than the exploration or qualitative methods. And these are the ones that are tended to percolate towards the top. And if we animate once, the methods that were highest are the ones pointed to here: discrete choice experiments, threshold technique, best for scaling 1 and 2, and swing weighting. And what we did in the points to consider is focused on these methods, but also with ideas that would apply to other methods. And the qualification included detailed descriptions of these 5 methods. One important point in bold: the methods themselves are not formally qualified. They're really examples of the many methods that can be used. What was qualified was actually the points to consider. And let me turn to my colleague, Brett Hauber, who will take us through the points to consider. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Bennett. Before we go into the points to consider themselves, I also wanted to state that one of the reasons we have points to consider as opposed to here's how to choose a method is that, you know, there is no cookbook approach to determining what is the appropriate method. And Prefer was not the first actually to undertake trying to develop points to consider for method selection. But at the same time, the users of the framework, including some people from the regulators, were interested in knowing what we did know about how to choose a particular method and what the advantages and disadvantages might be. So this is our attempt here to address that question, and this is what wound up in the final briefing book and final qualification opinion. So we organized the points to consider into 3 categories: methodological points to consider, participant points to consider, and feasibility points to consider. Next slide, please. For the methodological factors, those are the factors that describe the particular requirements and capabilities of the methods themselves. And this is where we're going to focus most of our time. These specifically address the ability of a particular method to answer the research question. Next slide, please. The participant factors describe the interaction of the patient with the patient population in 2 ways. First, it's the ability of the individual patients to complete a particular type of task, which often has to do with the cognitive abilities of the patient and the complexity of the preference elicitation task itself. And second, it also relates to how and whether the patient population can provide the necessary information. which most often involves sort of the size of the sample, the diversity of the sample, and the access to the patient population. If we go to the third slide, please. Under the feasibility factors, these relate to the expertise and the resources that a study sponsor or a study team would need in order to be able to execute one of these methods. So it's important to note before we move on that the methodological factors can also influence the suitability of a method for different types of participants and the feasibility of implementing a method given the resource constraints or the capabilities of the study sponsor. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the way that we sort of present this, other than a cookbook approach, is to think of this in terms of a hierarchy of factors. Next slide, please. So first, the methodological factors identify your set of feasible alternatives, the set of methods that could be used to answer the research question in your context. So that would be the first and most important place to start. And then if we go to the next slide. The patient-related factors and the feasibility factors can then be applied to the methods that have been identified as suitable when applying the methodological factors. Next slide, please. So here, what we focus on for the remainder of this webinar will be the methodological factors for the 5 most commonly used methods that Bennett already spoke to. So before we move on, I just want to remind everybody, we start with methodological. Identify what is appropriate for answering the research question. And I know of no situation where that has come down to only one option. So you'll often have multiple options, and then you can apply the patient-related factors and the feasibility factors more easily to determine what might be right in your particular circumstance. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So when we evaluated the 5 methods, we evaluated them against 8 points to consider. So first, some methods are designed primarily to provide sample level estimates, while others provide individual level estimates that are aggregated up to get sample level estimates. Second, does the method allow us to control for or test for preference heterogeneity, which is a very important concept in preference elicitation? And can we also identify the sources of that preference heterogeneity? The third point here relates to the minimum required sample size. Fourth, of all the 5 methods under consideration, they can all estimate preferences for individual attributes, but they differ in the number of attributes that they can address. And fifth, some methods focus on preferences for attributes or a single range for each attribute, while others focus on preferences for changes in attributes across multiple levels. And sixth, some methods provide evidence of relative importance and trade-offs, and sometimes the trade-offs can be inferred based on relative importance. And some do this the other way, where they estimate the trade-off first and then estimate relative importance based on those trade-offs. Some methods, like the DCE, directly elicit trade-offs among multiple attributes simultaneously, while methods such as the threshold technique estimate trade-offs among pairs of attributes. And then finally, some methods can account for interaction effects among attributes and others cannot. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So this slide and the next slide take those 8 factors to consider for methodology and apply them against the 5 different methods. So DCEs primarily provide sample level estimates. Some estimation methods allow you to infer or recover individual level estimates from the sample estimates. Threshold technique estimates allow you or provide for you a single number or interval for each pairwise trade-off for each individual, and the sample means are a function of the individual level estimates. For best worst 1 and best worst 2, simple methods can be used to recover individual level estimates, or the data can be analyzed at the sample level. And for swing weighting, each respondent provides a unique set of weights which can then be aggregated to calculate weights for the sample as a whole. All 5 methods can be used to address issues of preference heterogeneity. And then we get to sample size, which is a little bit difficult because the required sample size depends on more than just the method itself. So the assessment of sample size for each method is somewhat vague in the points to consider. And you'll notice that by, tends to be, depends on. These are really somewhat directional rather than specific. So there are some particular resources out there to help you understand the considerations for sample size, but it's very difficult a priori without knowing the actual questions that you will be asking what the minimum sample size should be. Then when we look at preferences of individual treatment features, all methods can elicit preferences for individual attributes, but the number of attributes each one can accommodate varies. In general, DCE and best worst scaling, because they best worst scaling 2, I should say, because they are profile-based methods, tend to be more limited in the number of attributes they can accommodate. And in general, best worst 1, threshold technique, and swing weighting can estimate preferences for each attribute or a single change in the levels of each attribute, while DCE and best worst scaling 2 almost always elicit preferences for more than 2 levels of each attribute. If we can go to the next slide, please. DCE and threshold technique tend to estimate rates of trade-off first, and then use that information to calculate relative importance, while swing weighting and best worst scaling 1 tend to do it the other way around. However, DCE can be used to estimate multiple trade-offs simultaneously, and the threshold technique tends to estimate 1 trade-off at a time. Best worst scaling 2 is unique because it considers multiple attributes in a profile like a DCE, but it considers only 1 profile at a time, unlike a DCE. So on the one hand, it appears to provide estimates of relative importance rather than trade-offs, like best worst scaling 1, but it does so more for multiple levels or a set of attributes simultaneously, like best worst, like DCE. And then finally, because they consider trade-offs simultaneously among a set of attributes, DCE and best worst 2 can easily account for interactions among attributes, while the other methods cannot. So this gives you a flavor of the type of considerations that go into these methodologic points to consider. And if we were expecting to see that these points to consider would give you absolute direction on which way to go, you can see that these are really just, in fact, points to consider. We could have also called them things to think about when considering method selection. So if we go to the next slide, please, the last slide in this section. So to summarize the points to consider that were qualified in the qualification opinion, if there's only one thing that people take from this presentation, I would like it to be that even with a small set of methods, we took this and we narrowed it down to 5. So we narrowed the focus of what we were talking about. The performance of each method on the methodological factors is not entirely unambiguous. So while we can provide some general ideas, the performance of a specific method on methodological grounds alone needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So there's more information about this in the briefing book and for the framework and the points to consider, as well as in the prefer recommendations. But really, it is important to know that these are guidelines for going through a process, as opposed to a decision metric that you would use to come to an unambiguous choice. And with that, I will turn it over. I think I turn it back to Jürgen at this point. Is that correct?
It's to me, Brett.
Or to Becky. Thanks, Becky.
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you to all the presenters. So we're about to turn to our panel discussion, but before we do that, there are 2 slides that I would like to work through. And that is that I've been tasked with sort of summarizing the whole of the impact and the outcome and the value of the qualification opinion. So we've tried to do that as succinctly as possible. And what you can see here is that we really wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge the effort of the CHMP to issue an opinion within Prefer's completion. Prefer has come to an end. We are now in our transition phase and our sustainability phase. So we were pleased that we were able to receive the CHMP's opinion just as Prefer was wrapping up. For those of you who are in industry and in regulatory, we wanted to reiterate that we heard from the CHMP that they confirmed that the framework is suitable for informing the objectives, design, conduct, and reporting of patient preference studies. We also wanted to highlight that in the opinion, we saw that the CHMP agreed that in principle, information on patient preference studies may be included in the clinical overview or the EPAR or other relevant documents. Obviously, we have yet to see this come to fruition, but it was wonderful to see this opinion from the CHMP. Also, we would be remiss if we didn't really recognize that the qualification was a sub-activity within the overall work plan, as you heard from Jürgen. And so in order to actually achieve what we've achieved, it really was the collaborative effort and it took the collective expertise, experiences, and outputs from a diverse community. But through that collaboration, we were able to achieve an impactful regulatory decision for all patient preference information users and stakeholders. And last but not least, we certainly hope and expect that the qualification opinion can further foster the use of patient preference information and contribute to additional activities and research. Next slide, please. And just as a bit of acknowledgement and thanks, as I mentioned, this wouldn't have been possible without the Prefer Qualification Subteam. Carl Steinbesser, who is our extraordinary project manager, is continuing to contribute in-kind time to support our sustainability and transition efforts. And it's due to his efforts that we were able to host today's webinar. So we thank Carl for his time and his expertise. We want to acknowledge Bayer for their financial contributions, which made moving the qualification forward. Avidira and RTI certainly helped contribute to our scientific efforts. Salmonson and Hemmings provided invaluable regulatory advice as we prepared the qualification. And then obviously to the overall IMI Prefer leadership. I'd also like to thank Natalie Signoret, who was our IMI scientific officer throughout this process, and the endorsement and support we had from IMI for pursuing the qualification. And although he's not able to be with us today, we also wanted to acknowledge Peter Moll, who unfortunately, due to a prior conflict, wasn't able to join our panel, but also provided support as we went through this process. So the next slide, please, Carl. So we're going to turn now to our panel discussion, and we still have a few minutes left. So I'd like to turn first to Laura Lee Johnson, who is a division director of the Biostatistics 3 office. And Laura Lee, I would like to hear your thoughts on how you see the qualification impacting or informing regulatory use of patient preference information in the future.
Sure, and thank you. And thanks to everybody who, this has been a multinational effort, and I want to thank everyone involved. So I do think that qualification helps regulatory agencies, and even though this came out of EMA, FDA has been reading and conversing as well. And it helps regulatory agencies gain experience outside of our normal marketing authorization process. So when I came to FDA, the way it was explained to me, and I think it's accurate, is that instead of maybe 20 years to learn a tool or method, we gain the same amount of knowledge in maybe 5 to 10 years. And that may seem long, but think about the other new to you methods in your company and how fast they're picked up, especially when they're not frequently seen. And you need a few thousand people to be aligned. This is actually pretty fast. So in a regulatory sense, I think the EMA qualification opinion is an early step in the maturation of patient preference studies. And the regulatory agencies will need to gain more experience in actual cases and applications. But the qualification has helped us discuss and consider the use of patient preference information in our discussions and interactions with patient groups, with ourselves, and with our with industry. And so we can think about that outside of a specific product development program or the few examples that we have internally. And it helps us use that learning when those programs do come in. So I know we're short on time, so I'll pause there.
Thank you, Laura Lee. Irina, I'd like to turn to you and ask a sort of a similar question and ask how you see the qualification impacting or informing the European HTA thoughts on the use of patient preference information in their reimbursement decisions.
Thank you, Becky, for that question. I think that the qualification procedure has been very critical for the preferred recommendations on how to assess and use patient preference data in HTA and reimbursement decision-making. Even though that we know that, and it has been explained by Isabel before, that EUnetHTA was going through a difficult time during the qualification procedure because the Joint Action 3 came to an end. We were all very much involved in preparing the HTA regulation and the implementation of that. So eventually EUnetHTA did not formulate a joint opinion on the preferred framework or the points to consider for method selection. But nevertheless, due to the involvement of EUnetHTA in the qualification procedure, we got a lot of very critical and useful input for formulating the preferred recommendations. So I think that even though there is no formal decision or opinion from EUnetHTA, there was a lot of interest from EUnetHTA partners, from HTA agencies. But now we are all preparing for the HTA, the implementation of the HTA regulation, which has been adopted in December 2021, which entered into force in January 2022, and the application, the actual first applications in terms of joint scientific consultations and joint clinical assessments will be in 2025. We are all very much preparing that right now within service level agreement EUnetHTA 21, where we are developing the methodological guidance for joint clinical assessments and joint scientific consultations. And I really think that in this context, there is room to use the recommendations coming out of this qualification opinion in the methodological guidances for future joint scientific consultations and assessments. And I think what is also very important to highlight is that there is a joint work plan now between EMA and the European HTA bodies within EUnetHTA 21. A joint work plan for up until 2023 that has, and I will just highlight 2 points that are in that work plan. And the first one is the relaunch of a European procedure for joint scientific consultations involving HTA bodies and EMA. So this is previously known as a parallel scientific advice. So in that context, it's of course very important to take the preferred recommendations along. And the second, action point on the work plan, amongst others, of course, is the generation of patient-relevant data or patient-relevant information to support decision-making, fostering development of methodologies in order to enable stronger reliance on patient-relevant data in context of decision-making. So I think these are 2 important work streams where patient preference information and guidance on how to take these into account could be taken into consideration. Although I do think that it's not for tomorrow that the HTA bodies will take it into account. I think that there will be a learning process and that will take time. But at least there are platforms where we can start discussing this.
Irina, thank you. I know we're over time, so I would like to wrap up maybe with just one final question. And Laura Lee, I'll tee that question up to you. And that is, what do you see for the next few years, for the foreseeable future, in terms of the development of and use of patient preference information, and how the qualification might inform that? So Mireille, for example, had mentioned ICH. Obviously, FDA has a series of activities that it plans to undertake with the reauthorization of PDUFA 7. And so I would just like to sort of give you a little bit of a platform to say, to ask how you see things developing and how the qualification might support that.
Sure. So, and I think that kind of in that future efforts department, the ICH, or International Council for Harmonization, we did publish a reflection paper, and this was Joint FDA and EMA, on patient-focused drug development that proposed a future ICH guideline addressing the methods for patient preference studies that would likely be informed by PREFER work and other previous and ongoing work as well. I'm not allowed to say much about PDUFA 7 right now. It is still in the US Congress, hasn't been made part of a law yet, but part of what was proposed there does include some additional efforts potentially as well. But I think that the EMA qualification opinion makes it clear that it is not guidance and nor a guideline. But I do think that there will be a lot of work that is built drawing on PREFER and drawing on this other work. So again, that's one reason we're very thankful that all of this work has come to good fruition and that the documents are made available publicly, so that a lot of this work can be learned from not only by the regulators and the international community, but by many other communities as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Laura Lee. Thank you to all of our presenters and our panel members today. I would just like to remind everyone who's joined us today that you can find a multitude of other webinars from PREFER that have been recorded and stored, and certainly this presentation has been recorded and you can come back to it. I'd also like to remind everyone that the PREFER recommendations are available. They are available through the PREFER website. You can go there to download them, as well as the qualification opinion itself. So we'd like to thank everybody for attending today. We hope you've found this useful and enjoyable, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you. Thanks all.